My name is Patricia Alvarez. I'm 44 years old. My daughter Nora is 19 and has Down syndrome. When she was 4, my parents told me, at a family dinner, that they didn't have the capacity to be part of a life that included a disabled grandchild, and they meant it. 15 years of birthdays, graduations, and holidays came and went without a single card, call, or visit. 3 weeks ago, one of Nora's paintings sold at a regional art auction for $18,000. 4 days after the auction results were posted online, my mother called me for the first time in over a decade. She didn't ask how Nora was doing. She didn't apologize for 15 years of silence. She asked whether Nora had representation yet, and whether there might be room for family at the next show. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever watched someone rediscover your family the moment it became convenient, comment too late below. This one's for you. Nora was born with Down syndrome, diagnosed prenatally, a diagnosis my husband Miguel and I had months to process before she arrived, though nothing fully prepares you for the specific reality of a child, only the abstract idea of one. What followed was years of early intervention, physical therapy, speech therapy, and the particular, exhausting joy of watching a child hit milestones on her own timeline rather than any charts. Nora, now 19, is warm, stubborn, and remarkably perceptive about people in ways that continue to surprise me even after 19 years of parenting her. She reads rooms quickly, understands tone and body language with an accuracy that sometimes catches adults off guard, and has an artistic talent that first revealed itself around age 7, when a special education teacher noticed her doing something unusual with color and proportion in a class assignment and gently suggested we look into art therapy, less as therapy and more as genuine skill development. That suggestion changed the trajectory of Nora's life in ways none of us could have predicted at the time. She spent the past 12 years developing a distinctive style, bold, layered acrylic work, mostly abstract, built around color relationships she describes with a specificity that outpaces most trained painters I've met. She had her first small local show at 14. By 17, a regional gallery had taken her on formally, representing her work alongside adult artists twice her age. I want to be honest that none of this success ever fully erased the earlier years, the years when the people who should have celebrated every one of Nora's milestones simply weren't there to see them. I remember, specifically, the day Nora painted her first piece that made me genuinely stop and look, rather than simply admire as a proud parent admires a child's art. She was 11, working through a difficult stretch at school where a new aide hadn't yet learned her communication style, and she'd come home frustrated, unable to fully articulate what had gone wrong that day. Instead of trying to explain it in words, she disappeared into her room for 2 hours and emerged with a canvas covered in overlapping shades of red and gray, jagged where her usual work tended toward smooth gradients. "This is what today felt like," she told me, holding it up. I understood, looking at it, that she'd found a language that worked better for her than speech sometimes did, a way of expressing complexity that didn't require anyone to wait patiently while she found the right words. That painting, more than any single moment before it, was when I understood art wasn't just a hobby for Nora. It was a form of communication as legitimate and necessary as any other. My parents, Diane and Robert, raised me and my younger brother Stephen in a household that valued achievement in a very specific, narrow sense: good grades, prestigious colleges, careers with recognizable titles. It wasn't an unloving household, exactly, but it was one where love and accomplishment were braided together tightly enough that I sometimes struggled, even as an adult, to tell where one ended and the other began. When I was pregnant with Nora, and the prenatal diagnosis came back, I remember calling my mother, still processing the news myself, hoping for the specific comfort only a parent can sometimes offer. What I got instead was a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a question I've never fully forgotten: "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I told her, as calmly as I could manage through my own shock, that we were absolutely keeping the pregnancy, that we were already in love with the daughter we hadn't met yet. My mother didn't argue further in that moment. But something in her voice, even then, told me this conversation wasn't over. Nora was 4 years old, well into the specific, delightful chaos of toddlerhood, functional and thriving in every way that mattered, when my parents invited Miguel and me to dinner, without the kids, at their house, a request that felt unusual enough, given how rarely they'd hosted us alone since Nora's birth, that I should have understood something significant was coming. We sat down to a meal my mother had clearly put real effort into, and about halfway through, my father set down his fork and said, in the careful, rehearsed tone of someone who'd practiced this conversation, "Your mother and I need to talk to you both about something." What followed was one of the most surreal conversations of my life. My father explained, in language that sounded almost clinical, that he and my mother had discussed it at length and had decided they didn't have the capacity, his word, to be part of a family that included a child with Down syndrome. He said it wasn't personal against Nora specifically, that they simply hadn't planned for this, hadn't built their retirement, their social lives, their expectations around a grandchild who would need different things than they'd anticipated providing. My mother added, quietly, that they hoped we'd understand that this wasn't a rejection of us, just a boundary they needed to set for their own well-being. I want to describe what I said in response, because I think the specificity of it matters more than the general shape of my anger. "You're telling me you're choosing to have no relationship with your own granddaughter," I said, "because she has an extra chromosome. Say that plainly. Don't dress it up as capacity or planning. Say the actual sentence." My father, to his credit in some strange, minimal sense, didn't flinch from the directness. "I suppose that is what I'm saying," he said. "I know how it sounds. I don't have a way to make it sound better than it is." My mother reached for my hand across the table, and I pulled it back, more instinctively than deliberately. "We still love you, Patricia," she said. "This isn't about you. It's entirely about me," I said. "It's about my daughter, who is a person, who is going to grow up knowing her grandparents chose not to know her. You don't get to separate loving me from rejecting her. She's not a separate category from our family. She is our family." I remember Miguel, beside me, saying very little through most of that conversation, his hand tight around mine under the table, saving his response for the car ride home, where he told me, plainly, that he would support whatever boundary I wanted to set, but that he personally never wanted Nora anywhere near people capable of saying what we'd just heard. What followed was not a dramatic, ongoing conflict. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more painful, 15 years of near-total silence, broken only by the occasional stiff, obligatory holiday card that never once mentioned Nora by name, addressed instead to the family, as though she were an abstraction rather than a specific little girl growing into a specific young woman. My brother Stephen, who had 2 children of his own during this period, maintained a relationship with our parents that Nora was simply excluded from by omission, family gatherings we weren't invited to, photos on social media where our absence went unremarked upon, an entire parallel family life happening around the edges of ours without acknowledgement. I want to be honest that the early years were the hardest. Nora's 5th birthday came and went without a card. Her first day of kindergarten, a milestone I'd photographed obsessively, generated no response when I'd sent a photo to my mother out of some lingering, stubborn hope that seeing Nora's face might change something. It didn't. By the time Nora was 10, I'd stopped sending updates entirely. Not out of spite, but out of the specific, protective exhaustion of continuing to offer connection to people who'd made their disinterest explicit and permanent. I redirected that energy toward the people who did show up, Miguel's parents, who adored Nora unconditionally from the moment they met her, a found family of friends and Nora's own expanding community of teachers, therapists, and eventually, fellow artists. The moment that crystallized, for me, exactly how complete the silence had become was Nora's high school graduation, 3 years ago, a milestone she'd worked toward for years within a program specifically designed to support her learning needs, walking across a stage to genuine, sustained applause from a gymnasium full of people who'd watched her grow up. I'd sent no invitation to my parents that year, having long since stopped extending gestures that were never reciprocated. But my brother Stephen, apparently feeling some late pang of conscience, mentioned the date to them in passing, and I found out afterward that they'd known, had the date and location, and chose not to attend, not even quietly, from the back of the room, not even to send a card afterward acknowledging the day had happened. I remember standing in that gymnasium, watching Nora's face as she crossed the stage, radiant with an accomplishment entirely her own, and feeling a specific, clarifying anger that outlasted the day itself, not because I expected my parents to suddenly show up, but because their absence, even then, still had the power to matter, still required a kind of active effort on my part not to let it diminish what should have been an uncomplicated, joyful day for my daughter. Nora, for her part, didn't seem to notice the absence in any way that visibly affected her. She was too busy celebrating with the people who had shown up, Miguel's parents in the front row, cheering loudly enough to embarrass her in exactly the way grandparents are supposed to. I want to address something directly, because I think it matters more than almost any other part of this story, what it was like to explain, over the years, why Nora didn't have a relationship with one set of grandparents. Nora, even as a young child, noticed the asymmetry, Miguel's parents present at every recital, every art show, every ordinary Tuesday, while my parents remained entirely absent, mentioned occasionally by cousins she barely knew, present only as a kind of theoretical relative she'd never actually met. Around age 8, she asked me directly, with the specific bluntness she's always had, why don't I have a grandma and grandpa like Emma does? Emma being a classmate whose grandparents picked her up from school regularly. I told her, in language calibrated to what an 8-year-old could hold, that she did have grandparents, but that they'd made a choice, a long time ago, not to be part of our family, and that the choice was about them, not about anything wrong with her. That's dumb, Nora said, with the specific, uncomplicated clarity children sometimes bring to things adults have spent years agonizing over. Why would anyone not want to know me? I'm cool. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count over the following 11 years. She wasn't wrong. She has, in fact, always been cool, in ways my parents chose to never find out for themselves. I want to describe, briefly, what the alternative looked like, because I think the contrast matters to understanding exactly what my own parents chose to forfeit. Miguel's parents, Rosa and Hector, met Nora for the first time when she was 6 months old, and from that very first visit, treated her with the same uncomplicated delight they'd shown their other grandchildren, born without any disability. Rosa learned, over the following years, the specific signs and adaptive communication tools Nora used before she developed more verbal speech, sitting with her patiently for hours, treating the learning itself as a genuine pleasure rather than an obligation. Hector built Nora a small easel for her 8th birthday, sized specifically to her height at the time, and replaced it twice more over the following decade as she grew, each one a little larger, a little more suited to the increasingly ambitious scale of her work. He still has the first one in his garage, unable, he's told me, to give it away. Rosa and Hector attended every single art show Nora has ever had, without exception, including several small, sparsely attended early ones where they were sometimes the only audience beyond the gallery staff themselves. They never once treated Nora's disability as something requiring explanation or apology to the people around them. They simply loved her, consistently, unremarkably, in the exact way grandparents are supposed to love a grandchild, a contrast that, I think, made my own parents' 15 years of absence even harder to fully process, because I had, right in front of me, constant proof of what it actually looked like to show up. Nora's art teacher, a woman named Ms. Reyes who taught at her school's inclusive art program, was the first person to formally recognize what would eventually become the central thread of Nora's adult life. She approached Miguel and me when Nora was 12, showing us a series of pieces that, even to my untrained eye, felt genuinely different from typical student work, a confident, unusual relationship with color that felt deliberate rather than accidental. We enrolled Nora in additional classes, found a private instructor willing to work with her specific communication style, and watched, over the following years, as her work developed a genuine, recognizable voice. Her first small show, at 14, sold 3 pieces to strangers who had no idea Nora had Down syndrome until they met her at the opening, work that had moved them entirely on its own merit before any context about the artist was attached. By 17, a regional gallery owner named Frank Delacroix, who'd built a reputation for supporting outsider and self-taught artists, approached us after seeing Nora's work at a juried show, offering formal representation. Nora, by that point, had developed enough of her own vocabulary around her work that she negotiated some of the terms herself, with Frank's patient, genuine engagement with her as an artist first and a young disabled woman second, the exact opposite of how my parents had once approached her existence. I want to describe Frank's first meeting with Nora in some detail, because I think it illustrates something important about the difference between genuine respect and the performative version my parents eventually offered. Frank spent nearly an hour at that juried show talking with Nora directly about her process, her color choices, the specific emotional logic behind pieces he was considering for representation, questions posed exactly the way he'd have posed them to any adult artist he was courting for his gallery, with no softening, no simplified vocabulary, no unspoken assumption that her answers would need translation or interpretation. "I don't represent artists as a charity case," he told Miguel and me afterward, while Nora was occupied looking at other pieces in the show. "I represent artists whose work moves me. Nora's work moves me. I'd be doing this regardless of anything else about her, and I want to be clear about that, because I think she deserves to know the difference between someone who's interested in her work and someone who's interested in a story about overcoming. That distinction, interest in the work itself versus interest in a narrative about overcoming, became something of a guiding principle for how our family thought about Nora's career going forward. It's also, I think, exactly the distinction my parents failed to grasp, even years later, when their sudden interest arrived wrapped entirely around a dollar figure rather than anything resembling genuine engagement with who Nora actually was as an artist or a person. 3 weeks before this story reaches its turning point, a regional charity auction, benefiting a local arts education nonprofit, included one of Nora's larger pieces, a layered, deep blue abstract work she'd titled, with characteristic directness, "This is what I actually think about." Nora attended the auction herself, standing near her piece for most of the evening, talking to interested bidders about her process with the specific, confident directness she brings to any conversation about her art. The piece, estimated beforehand at somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 based on her gallery's prior sales, ended up in an extended bidding war between two collectors, eventually selling for $18,000, a career record for her, and enough to generate real, if modest, coverage in the regional arts press and a fair amount of attention on social media, where the auction house had posted results publicly. I remember standing beside Nora when the final bid was announced, watching her face go through a specific, delighted disbelief before settling into something closer to quiet pride. "That's a lot of money for a painting," she said, once we were in the car afterward. "I think I'm actually good at this." "You are," I told her. "You've always been good at this." For days after the auction results were posted, including a photo of Nora standing beside her sold piece that had circulated fairly widely in local arts circles, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in over a decade, though I recognized it instantly. My mother's voice, when I answered, sounded almost cheerful, a register I hadn't heard directed at me in 15 years. "Patricia. I saw the news about Nora's painting. $18,000. We're just so proud of her." I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, genuinely unsure how to respond to the specific surrealism of hearing pride in my mother's voice for the first time in association with my daughter's name. "You're proud of her," I repeated, carefully. "Of course we are," my mother said, apparently not registering anything strange in the fact that this was, functionally, the first time she'd expressed any interest in Nora's life in 15 years. "Does she have representation yet, for her career? Your father and I were wondering if there might be room for family at her next show. We'd love to be there to support her." I want to describe the specific, cold clarity that settled over me during that call, because I think it matters more than the anger I might have expected to feel. "Mom," I said, "Nora is 19. She's had representation for 2 years. She's had gallery shows for 5 years. She's had a life, an entire childhood and adolescence, that you have not been part of for a single day of it. And your first question, the first thing you're asking me about, is whether there's room for family now that there's money attached to her name." "That's not fair," my mother said, her cheerfulness curdling quickly into defensiveness. "We've always loved Nora. Things were different back then. We didn't know how to handle it. You told us, at your own dinner table, that you didn't have the capacity to be part of a family with a disabled grandchild," I said. "You used that exact word. Capacity." I remember it precisely, because I've had 15 years to remember it. Nothing about Nora's capacity has changed. She's the same person she was at 4. What's changed is that she's now, apparently, financially interesting to you. There was a long silence on the line. That's an unkind thing to say, my mother finally said. It's an accurate thing to say, I told her. You didn't call 4 days ago, when it was just an ordinary Tuesday. You called 4 days after an auction result went public. I need you to sit with the timeline of that before you ask me anything else about access to my daughter. A few days later, my father called separately, apparently having decided a different approach might land better than my mother's had. I know this looks bad, he said, without much preamble. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But we're genuinely proud of what Nora's accomplished. I'd like the chance to tell her that myself, if you'd allow it. You had 15 years of chances to tell her things yourself, I said. Birthdays. Graduations. Ordinary Tuesdays. You chose, deliberately and explicitly, not to take any of them. I'm not going to pretend the sudden interest, timed exactly to a public auction result, is the same thing as the relationship you could have had this whole time. What do you want from us? He asked, sounding genuinely uncertain, which was, I think, the most honest moment of either conversation. An apology? We can give you that. I don't actually know what I want from you, I said, and I meant it. But I know it's not this. I know it's not a phone call that only happened because of a number attached to her name. If you want to actually repair something, it's going to require a lot more than admiration for a painting. My brother Stephen called a few days after my parents did, and I want to be honest that I approached the call with more wariness than I did with either of my parents' calls, given how completely he'd maintained a relationship with them throughout the 15 years they'd excluded Nora. I heard from Mom and Dad about the auction, he said. I wanted to check in with you directly, actually, not just to talk about that. I asked him, plainly, whether he'd known, over the years, how completely our parents had excluded Nora, or whether he'd simply not thought about it much, given his own separate relationship with them. He was quiet for a long moment. I knew, he admitted. I think I told myself it wasn't my place to intervene, that it was between you and them. I think that was a convenient thing to tell myself, honestly, because it meant I didn't have to choose a side or make things uncomfortable at the family gatherings I was still attending. That's an honest answer, I said. I appreciate you giving it to me instead of a softer version. I've been thinking about it a lot since the auction thing happened, Stephen said. About how quickly they called you once there was money involved, compared to 15 years of nothing before that. I think I always kind of knew that's who they were capable of being, if I'm honest. I just never had to look at it directly, because Nora wasn't in the room for me to see it happening. I told him I appreciated the honesty, even as it added a complicated new layer to the whole situation, a reminder that my parents' silence toward Nora had existed within a wider family ecosystem that had, in its own way, quietly permitted it to continue unchallenged for 15 years. I debated, for several days, how much of this to tell Nora, given how directly it involved her, and given her own specific relationship to the grandparents she'd grown up without. I decided, ultimately, that she deserved the full truth, delivered honestly, the way I've tried to deliver difficult information to her throughout her life, not simplified into something less true, just calibrated to be genuinely understandable. I told her about the calls, both of them, as plainly as I could manage. She listened carefully, the way she does when something matters, and then asked, so they only called because of the money? It looks that way, I told her honestly. The timing is pretty hard to explain any other way. Nora was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the specific stillness she brings to things that land somewhere deep. That's messed up, she said finally. They didn't want me when I was just me. Now they want me because I made money. That's exactly right, I said. And I want you to know, you don't owe them anything. Not access, not forgiveness, not a relationship. You get to decide, completely on your own terms, what happens next, if anything does. What Nora decided to do surprised me, though in retrospect, it shouldn't have, It was entirely consistent with the directness that has defined her whole life. "I want to talk to them myself," she said. "Not to be mean. I just want to tell them what I think, in my own words. I don't want you doing it for me this time. I want to be honest that this request required real trust on my part, and real restraint. The instinct to protect Nora from a difficult conversation is one I've carried her whole life, and choosing to step back from that instinct, to let her advocate for herself directly with the people who'd rejected her, was genuinely difficult. But I also understood, watching her decide this, that it was exactly the kind of self-advocacy her entire life had been building toward, the same directness that had made her art genuinely hers, rather than a version filtered through anyone else's expectations. I arranged a call, with Miguel and me present but silent, giving Nora the space to say whatever she needed to say directly to my parents. Nora's voice, when the call connected, was steady in a way that made me quietly, fiercely proud. "Hi, Grandma." "Hi, Grandpa," she said. "Mom told me you called. I wanted to talk to you myself." There was a pause on the other end, both my parents apparently caught off guard by the directness of Nora initiating the conversation herself. "I know you didn't want me when I was little," Nora continued, her voice not unkind, but entirely without softening. "Mom told me what you said, about capacity. I've had 15 years to think about that word. I don't think you actually meant you didn't have room. I think you meant you were embarrassed, or scared, or didn't want people asking questions about me. I think capacity was just a nicer word for that." My father started to respond, but Nora continued, not unkindly, but without pausing to let him interrupt. "I'm not calling to be mean," she said. "I just want you to know, I had a really good childhood, even without you. I have grandparents who love me, Miguel's parents, and they've been at every single thing that ever mattered to me. I don't need you to complete my life. You had your chance to be part of it, when it was just me, no money, no auction, nothing interesting to anyone but the people who actually loved me. You said no. I think it's fair that I get to say no now too." My mother, on the other end of the line, was crying by the time Nora finished, though I want to describe what I heard in that crying carefully, because I think the distinction matters. "I don't know what to say," my mother said, her voice thick. "You're right. I don't have a good defense for any of it." "I'm not asking for a defense," Nora said. "I'm just telling you what I think. I'm not angry, exactly. I just don't think I owe you access to my life because a painting sold for a lot of money. If you actually want to know me, that's a different conversation, and it would take a long time, and it wouldn't be about my art at all. But I don't think that's actually what this call was about, was it?" There was a long silence before my mother answered, honestly, in a way I hadn't expected from her. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think I need to think about that honestly, instead of just answering the way I want you to hear." "That's fair," Nora said. "I'm not going anywhere. If you figure it out, you know how to reach us. But I'm not going to keep waiting the way Mom did for 15 years. I have a life. It's a good one. It was good before this call, and it'll be good after it too." In the weeks following that call, my parents did not immediately reappear with grand gestures or dramatic attempts at reconciliation, which I think, in its own strange way, was the most honest response available to them. My mother sent a letter, several weeks later, addressed directly to Nora rather than filtered through me, a genuine attempt, from what I could tell, at the kind of honest reckoning Nora had asked for rather than requested. It didn't excuse the 15 years. It didn't pretend the timing of the phone call hadn't been exactly what it looked like. But it was, as far as I could assess, an honest attempt at naming what had happened without the softening language my father had once used at that dinner table. Nora read the letter carefully, several times, before deciding, on her own terms, to write back, not a full reconciliation, but an acknowledgement that she'd received it, and a clear statement of what she'd need to see, over time, before she'd consider any deeper relationship possible. My own relationship with my parents remains, even now, unresolved in any clean sense. I've allowed a small amount of renewed contact, brief calls, mostly initiated by my mother, conversations that stay carefully surface level, testing whether any real change underlies the sudden interest. I don't know yet whether that change is genuine or whether it will hold, over time, in a way that matters. I've learned, over 15 years, not to extend trust based on stated intentions alone, only on sustained, demonstrated behavior across enough time to actually mean something. What I do know, with total certainty, is that Nora's own response to all of this, her clarity, her refusal to be grateful for attention that arrived only once she became financially interesting, her insistence on speaking for herself rather than letting anyone else manage the conversation on her behalf, represents exactly the kind of self-possession I've hoped, for her entire life, that she would eventually have the standing to claim. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say we welcomed my parents back fully, grateful for their eventual interest regardless of its timing, or alternatively, that we cut them off completely and permanently, refusing any further contact at all. Neither is quite accurate, and I think it's more honest to say so. What actually happened was something in between, still unfolding, still uncertain, a recognition that people who reject you at your most vulnerable, and reappear only once you become valuable by conventional standards, have shown you something true about their priorities that doesn't simply reverse because they've changed their behavior after the fact. I used to think the hardest part of raising Nora would be the practical challenges, the therapies, the advocacy, the constant work of building a world that would actually make room for her. I've since learned there's a different kind of hard, watching people who should have loved her unconditionally reveal, plainly, that their love had conditions all along, conditions that only stopped mattering once a number appeared attached to her name. A few weeks after that call, Nora and I were in her studio, a converted section of our garage where she does most of her work, and she brought the whole thing up again, unprompted, while mixing a new batch of blue paint. "I keep thinking about what I said," she told me. "About how they didn't want me when I was just me. I think that's the part that's actually true, even if everything else gets complicated later." "I think you're right," I told her. "I'm glad I said it myself," she said. "I know you would have said it for me. But I think it mattered that it came from me. Like, this is my life. I get to decide who's allowed to be proud of me, and when." I sat with that sentence for a long time afterward, the way I imagine I'll continue sitting with it for years to come, the specific, hard-won wisdom of a 19-year-old who understands something about conditional love that took me considerably longer to fully name, even as her own mother. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I think about every time I watch Nora work in her studio, layering color with the same confident, deliberate hand she's always had, entirely unbothered by whether anyone watching understands what she's doing or why. Love that only shows up once someone becomes valuable by external standards was never really about the person in the first place. It was about what they could eventually provide, dressed up, for years, in language about capacity and readiness and timing, until a number large enough to be impossible to ignore finally arrived and revealed the actual condition that had been there all along. A year after the auction, and after that first difficult phone call, my relationship with my parents remains cautious, uneven, still being tested in real time rather than resolved into anything I could describe as settled. My mother has, to her credit, sustained a slow, consistent pattern of contact that has felt, increasingly, less performative than it did in that first phone call, birthday cards that arrive on time now, addressed specifically to Nora rather than the family, brief updates about her own life that don't circle back, every time, to asking about Nora's career or upcoming shows. My father has been slower to change, though he did attend one small show last spring, standing quietly at the back, buying nothing, simply present, which Nora noted afterward with a kind of careful, measured acknowledgement rather than any dramatic emotional reunion. I don't know if this slow thaw will continue, or whether it will eventually reveal itself as another kind of performance, sustained only as long as it takes to fully repair their standing with a daughter and granddaughter who now, undeniably, have some public visibility attached to their name. I've learned, over 15 years and one very clarifying phone call, to withhold judgment until behavior has had enough time to prove itself one way or the other. I think, if there's a single thing I'd want another parent of a disabled child to take from this story, it's the specific, hard-won understanding that you are allowed to stop extending connection to people who have made their disinterest explicit, regardless of how that decision looks to extended family, regardless of how many holiday cards go unanswered before you finally let yourself stop sending them. I spent years believing that maintaining some thread of contact, however thin, was inherently better than cutting it entirely, that keeping the door open, even to people who'd shown no interest in walking through it, was the more generous, more forgiving choice. I've since learned that a door held open indefinitely, to people who've made clear they have no intention of using it, isn't generosity. It's just a wound you keep re-exposing, on their behalf, at your own expense. Nora's clarity, when she finally got the chance to speak for herself, taught me more about healthy boundaries than 15 years of my own careful diplomacy ever had. She didn't need my parents' validation to become who she is. She built that entirely on her own, with the people who actually showed up, one painting, one show, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Their sudden interest, arriving 15 years too late and precisely on schedule with a headline, doesn't get to rewrite that history. She made sure of that herself, in her own words, on her own terms, in a phone call I'll remember for the rest of my life. If you've ever watched someone rediscover interest in you or someone you love the moment it became convenient, I'd love to hear how you handled it. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.